much more than 100 years ago, the Garden of Eden was relocated. Nothing like that had happened before. For as long as anyone could remember, the Garden of Eden was part of an exotic and improbable scene. Nowhere was there a door or a roof. Adam and Eve lived in the open with monkeys and griffins on hand for room service. Fruit was theirs for the asking, too much so in the end. They were never short of something to drink. Huge birds hung overhead like Goodyear blimps. Lion lay down with lamb, and iguana with peccary. The sky was always blue. Here and there, on the impeccable, mole-free lawns, fountains threw their jets high in the air without help from engineering. Well, not everyone was convinced by all this, but they got used to it. So, it was quite a shock when Monet, Renoir, and their fellow Impressionists relocated the Garden of Eden and set it down in commuter country near Paris. It didn't take at first. This Eden was too close to home, too much a part of the new everyday. But in time, it got through to people the world over that commuter country near Paris was the very image of well-being. This was an Eden they could live with, and a close look will show us why. They loved the little trains by Monet and the sunlit riverbanks just down the road from the station. They loved the little boats, Monet again, that seemed to fly the flag of liberty. They loved the waterborne dance hall by Monet and by Renoir that looked like more fun than any place they'd ever seen. However, Impressionism was not just Monet and Renoir. It had quite a large cast of characters, some of them rather oddly assorted. It's natural that we should wonder what they were like. Were they a band of brothers with here and there a gifted sister? Or were they like strangers on a train? Were they a united group with an agreed-upon program? Or did each one just show up on his own? Let's look at how they stacked up. There was Camille Pissarro, born in the Virgin Islands of ancient Portuguese Jewish stock. There was Paul Cézanne, the son of a Frenchman who'd done very well indeed as a hatter, and in 1848 bought the only bank in the town of Aix-en-Provence. What could they possibly have in common? Everything that mattered was the answer. And at a crucial moment in their careers, they were very close indeed, because Impressionism was about individual genius, but also, at certain times, about hanging in there together. And at the beginning, and for quite some time, there was Edouard Manet. Now, it may seem peculiar that this was so. As painted by Fontaine-Latour, he didn't look like an artist, let alone an avant-garde artist. And as painted by himself, he made it quite clear that he wasn't the kind of artist who got messy on the job. What's more, he wasn't really an impressionist at all. That is to say, a painter who worked from his immediate sensations, preferably in the open air, and set these down in small, individual brushstrokes. What a ridiculous idea, painting in the open air, he used to say, when the Impressionists were risking their entire futures on doing just that. He was a big city man, an in man, a man with money, a man with position. Walking along the Parisian streets with his straight back, with his loose-limbed, jaunty gait, you would have thought that all he cared about in life was to amuse himself. Here you see him sketched by Degas. As for the country, it was all very well so long as you didn't have to live there. He loved flowers, but he didn't want to go out in the country to see them. He liked them already arranged and placed in a very clean glass of water. He loved women, and when he painted them, it showed. Someone who knew what he was talking about said of Manet, and I quote, He is one of 5 or 6 men in present-day Parisian society who still know how to talk to a woman. The rest of us, when faced with a pretty woman, are like bears dancing the polka. Manet is the happy exception. Wit, friendliness, good manners, originality, all spiced with the free air of the studio, that's our Manet. These were sketches by someone who was crazy about women's clothes, Edouard Manet. He knew a lot about women's fashions, and he had a particular fondness for hats. And these are portraits. The legs belong to one friend of Manet's, the sumptuous behind to another. The ladies got the sketches through the mail, and I hope that at least one of them was pleased. Manet was an incorrigible coureur. Once his long-suffering wife caught up with him trailing a pretty girl in the street. He wheeled around. "Why, my dear, I thought it was you." Manet was at home with himself, and he was at home really in every situation of modern life. While many of the Impressionists were literally in a rut, painting bad winter weather in poky little towns, he was as much at his ease at a masked ball at the Opera or with the execution of Emperor Maximilian in Mexico. As a playwright in paint, he liked ambiguous, complicated subjects, and if he couldn't find them ready-made, he went right ahead and invented them. We'll never know what was going on in that conservatory, any more than we'll ever know what went on at that luncheon in the studio. But how we'd like to know. To everything Manet did, he brought a sharp cutting edge, a disdain for cant, a skeptical eye for accepted values. Any museum director would kill to get these two paintings today. But at the time, it was Manet who got killed, or just about, by the attacks upon them and upon himself. Those paintings were real acts of courage. And to younger painters like Monet and Renoir, Manet was the man who had declared war on the official art establishment in Paris, had taken his lumps and kept going in spite of it. He had declared war in 1863 with the Déjeuner sur l'herbe. You see, it was all right at that time to paint naked women if they were goddesses or allegories. But Manet's women were obviously right out of contemporary life and were up to no good. To show you what he was up against, here are 2 favorites from the salon of that period. We can see at once the soapy, mawkish quality of Cabanel's Birth of Venus, and the evident hypocrisy with which Henner showed us just enough of his chaste Susanna to titillate the bourgeois public. Now, I must tell you that Napoleon III immediately fell for the Birth of Venus and bought her on sight. She also seduced 2 wealthy American businessmen, and Cabanel had to paint 2 replicas. One is in Philadelphia, and one is right here in the Metropolitan Museum. In all fairness to Napoleon III, I must say that in 1863, when the jury of the Salon rejected more than half of the 5,000 entries, he decreed that there should be an annex salon for the rejected pictures, a Salon des Refusés it was called, so that the public could make up its own mind. But that only happened once. In 1870, Théodore Fontaine-Latour was working on one of the group portraits that were to be, to his time, what the corporate portraits of Rembrandt and Frans Hals had been to the Dutch 17th century. As to who should be the central figure, he never had any doubt. Manet had to be there, right in the middle. In fact, the painting was made in Manet's studio, not in Fontaine's, in the northern section of Paris called Les Batignolles. Fontaine didn't want just anybody in this picture. He wanted it to be the honor roll of the not yet named movement that would be Impressionism. We can guess from the dusky, secretive atmosphere of these sketches that Fontaine wasn't quite sure of what he wanted to do and was weighing all the options. In the finished painting, there's Manet dominating from the easel, though he doesn't seem to be painting anything very much. Fontaine did not have the gift of animation, and the others are standing around as if they've never been introduced and what's more don't want to be. Going around clockwise, the standing figures, we first have a painter called Otto Schilderet, who had just scraped into the Metropolitan Museum, and then looking unusually withdrawn, the more usually gregarious Auguste Renoir. Then we have the novelist Émile Zola, boyhood friend of Cézanne and off-again, on-again champion of the Impressionists. Next to him is a musician called Edmond Maître, who used to play four-hand piano pieces with Frédéric Bazille. And next to him is Frédéric Bazille. On the extreme right is the man that many people considered the real founder of Impressionism, Claude Monet. Now, I must tell you right away that no one member of our cast of characters was the sole founder of Impressionism, although Monet rather enjoyed telling interviewers that he was the one that had given the movement its name. When he sent that painting to what became the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874, he made life easy for the critics by calling it Impression at Sunrise. Everybody loves a catchy name, and from then on, he, Monet, Renoir, Pissarro were all known as Impressionists. Actually, Renoir would have preferred irregularists, but nobody quite knew what that meant. Later on, some of the members of the group would have liked intransigence, but Impressionist is the name that stuck. Now, actually, that's not a typical painting at all of Monet at that time. In the 1860s, he had excelled at exact, vivacious statements in which strong sunlight played a strong role. But rather soon, as you can guess from Renoir's painting of Monet working away in his garden near Paris, quite soon Monet came to be accepted as the painter par excellence who worked directly in the open air. Even Manet, who quite disdained people who painted in the open air, tried it towards the end of his life. He went to Argenteuil and joined Monet and his family and painted Monet working away in his floating studio. And sometime later, about 1890, John Singer Sargent also recorded Monet in what we might call today his signature position. But nobody was born an Impressionist, and when he began his career, it never occurred to Monet to paint in the open air. He grew up in Le Havre, and still as a boy, he had a gift for caricatures. They weren't very delicate, but they were funny, they were incisive, they were good likenesses. People bought them. What more could he want? Still, it wasn't really much of an ambition, and someone who told him that he should aim higher was a local painter, Eugène Boudin. You see Boudin on the screen, who had spotted Monet's caricatures early on. He urged Monet to get out into the open, to stand on his own 2 feet, to look with his own 2 eyes, and what with the sea and the sky and the people who moved around somewhere between the two, he would never lack a wonderful subject. Monet simply didn't want to hear that. Besides which, he didn't think much of Boudin's delicate presentations of the passing moment. However, Boudin kept at him, and finally, Monet went to Paris, put in time at art school, came back to Le Havre, and did exactly what Boudin had told him to do. And by the time he was 25, he was painting big-shouldered pictures of the seashore near his father's house. Now, they had none of Boudin's finesse, but they were dense, meaty, factual, and they were the work of a man who would paint till he dropped. He didn't wait for good weather either. Someone who came across him in 1867, painting in the snow, never forgot the sight of Monet bolt upright by his easel in the bitter cold, wearing thick gloves, 3 overcoats, one on top of the other, and there was a little brazier on the ground to warm his feet. But when he came to paint the magpie, driven half crazy by the cold, he got the blues and the whites of the snow just right and forgot all about the thermometer. And he enjoyed the little train that made light of the weather and came puffing along as usual. He lived at a time where the only place to get ahead was the annual official salon. Now, even if you made it past the jury, your entries had to fight for their life amongst hundreds, if not thousands of pictures by other people. So the best way to beat them down was to paint on a grand scale. Monet tried that twice, and we're delighted with the results. The fragmented Déjeuner sur l'herbe, you see two of the pieces here. The Déjeuner sur l'herbe was never finished. It lay rolled up in Monet's landlord's damp cellar for years. He couldn't pay the rent. And finally, it was cut into several pieces. And it's only from the completed sketch in Moscow that we can have an idea of what the finished painting might have been like. Monet's obliging friend, Frédéric Bazille, posed for 4 of the 7 male pictures. And the other big painting, The Women in the Garden, got turned down by the Salon. It was bought by the obliging Bazille on the installment plan. And then when he died, it was acquired by Manet. Now, Monet worked and worked on those pictures, and the work shows. We can see the enormous and quite unspontaneous efforts that he made to achieve the natural look on a huge scale and in the open air. You can see from the portraits by Renoir that Monet was a forthright, chesty sort of fellow. He didn't have much to say about his paintings, but neither he nor they were any the worse for that. But we do know for sure that his painting, the Terrace at Sainte-Adresse, a painting that everybody loves, by the way, was not the result of what the song called doing what comes naturally. It may look to us completely easy and natural. Well, it wasn't, of course. Impressionism was as artificial a way of putting the world down on canvas as any. And in that respect, the Terrace at Sainte-Adresse is as cunning as a picture can be in its flattening of form, its treatment of light and color, its artful alternation of the crisscross of the balustrade with the gentle ovals of the chairbacks. We see a first-rate picture architect at work. There was something new to painting in the matter-of-fact way with which Monet plotted his repeated right angles, the upward thrust of the bright red flowers, and the abruptly foreshortened perspective. The foreground, as you see, is tilted up towards us. The middle ground is nipped and tucked into place, while the horizon is pulled towards us by the frantic movement of the flags. No Sunday painter could have touched in those ships as neatly. Monet was aware, and makes us aware, whether consciously or not, that virtually every one of them was contributing to the prosperity of his father, who was a major importer and exporter at Le Havre. No wonder he looked so pleased with life. He sits wedged into the right-hand corner of the painting, as if defying anyone to dislodge him. Even the angle of the cane suggests a note of pre-Freudian masculinity. Monet was summing up his own life to date in that picture, not least the irony that both he and his father recently had sired children out of wedlock. So there is more to the Terrace at Sainte-Adresse than simply an invigorating image of well-dressed people on their best behavior. As a storyteller, Monet had potential. When we look at the woman sitting on a bench, the man with the tall hat behind her, we may find them as dreary a pair as we're ever likely to meet. However, such is Monet's dogged way with them that we're rather curious about them. Who are they? What happened next? Well, they don't seem to be having much fun at that luncheon party. Monet, however, simply didn't care about things like that. As he grew older, and to an ever greater extent, the act of painting became his subject matter, the only one that absorbed him completely. And as for the human figure in art, it might never have existed. The fact that he was looking at Rouen Cathedral or the Houses of Parliament seen from his hotel window in London was a matter of almost indifference to him. It was fidelity to the passing moment that counted, and in that he was the primary impressionist. And when Cézanne said of him, I quote, "Monet is just an eye, but what an eye," it was not a put-down. It was all very well being the proto-impressionist, as active in winter as in summer, but it didn't get Monet anywhere with the Salon, where he was rejected, from where he was rejected as often as not. Now, the Salon, with its 40,000 odd attendants and its massive newspaper coverage, was not only an incomparable market, it was the only market. And so, in 1873, Monet and a few friends got together to plan a artist collective exhibition where they could go in on their own and show their works. It was not going to be easy, it wasn't going to be cheap, but they had nothing to lose. And so, the next year, in April of 1874, what came to be known as the first Impressionist exhibition opened in rooms lent by the great early photographer Nadar, who lent them for free, by the way. It was quite a mixed bag. There was Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Guillaumin, Berthe Morisot, Degas, all kinds of people. But the really interesting works ranged from Monet's own Boulevard des Capucines, painted from those same rooms the year before, to Edgar Degas' Carriage at the Races. Edgar Degas exhibited in 7 of the 8 Impressionist group shows, but he never thought of himself as an Impressionist. Still less did he believe, as they did, that art could be reinvented every time you went out into the open air and started registering your own impressions. He believed that art should be built on older art, and when he began his career, he copied from the old masters, from Botticelli, from Michelangelo, like any beginner, only very much better. He believed that spontaneity had no role in art, and that a painting, like a crime, should be combined carefully, systematically, and methodically. He said, what happens today is totally different. They get hold of some poor young man, send him out into a field, and tell him to start painting. Paint, they say, and he paints a sincere field. What could be more idiotic? When he was 25 and was visiting the Uffizi in Florence, he was sketched by his traveling companion, the artist Gustave Moreau. And there he looks like a young angel who had left his wings behind in the check room. Just 3 years later, as painted by himself, he comes on like what he was, a man who loved big cities and was totally at home there. His family were in important business all the way from Naples to New Orleans. He never had not known exactly where he stood in the world and who he was. He was totally unprovincial. From his school days onwards, he did what he liked, he went where he liked, he said what he liked, even though it annoyed some people very much indeed. Every member of his family had style, from his younger brother Achille, painted there in his cadet's uniform, to his sister Thérèse, about to marry an Italian aristocrat. Degas' mother died when he was very young, so he really had no experience of married people, happy or otherwise. But like many people who grew up very much on their own, he was terribly observant. His aunt, Laure, had to make a marriage of convenience. Her father forced her into it, and she married a Neapolitan called the Baron Bellelli. They had 2 children. She brought them up very strictly and very well. But Degas saw that even if outwardly this was an advantageous marriage, it was in fact little more than a gallows on which she was left hanging, a gold-plated gallows, but a gallows nevertheless. He finished this painting, rather he started this painting, the group painting of them, when he was only 24. When it was finished, his aunt wrote to him and said how dreary it must have been for him to have to look day after day at her sad face and at her husband's disagreeable one. His sister, Thérèse, also married a Neapolitan, the Duc de Morbilly. He was a first cousin, so this had caused quite a lot of trouble. They had to get a special dispensation from the Pope to marry. But apparently the marriage was not much of a success. And we gather that by Degas' way with them. Because as much as Ibsen in his plays and Ingmar Bergman in his movies, Degas had an unerring instinct for conjugal unhappiness. His family was a musical one. They were very cultivated people, and his father enjoyed having musicians come and perform at home. And here you see his father listening to a Spanish tenor and guitarist called Pagans. And you may guess that the father was very frail. He was not going to live much longer. Degas was anything but sentimental, but he treasured that painting all his life. With his father, he was taken out to meet a number of elderly, stylish Parisians. They all wore battered hats, he remembered later. And some of them had a passion that he was later to share, a passion for collecting. Here, he persuades us that a portfolio of prints can outrank in interest anything else in life. He was to become such a man. By the time he was 50, he said, "I want to live and die all alone, with no happiness whatsoever." He knew that some people live in the margins of what's called real life, and that he was one of them. And he identified with such people, from his sister-in-law, who lived in New Orleans and who was blind, to the unnamed woman who was edged almost out of the picture by a great forest of autumn flowers. She only got in as an afterthought, but Degas rather liked her wary, abstracted look, and he felt that the threatening mass of flowers would provide just the right note of tension and ambiguity. He never liked the standard centered pose in portraiture. He felt that a portrait should be a duet for equals between sitter and environment. He also believed that body language spoke as clearly as facial expression. When he did these two pastels of Mary Cassatt in the Louvre, we don't see her face, but from her enveloping hat, her floor-length hemline, her perfectly rolled umbrella, and her attentive stance, we recognize the very model of the enlightened American woman abroad. The notion of a portrait being a duet between sitter and environment came out very strongly in the portrait of his friend Henri Michel Lévy. Lévy was a good minor painter, but he's shown virtually walled into a far corner of his studio, surrounded by art and the instruments of his art, not least a life-sized, fully dressed puppet that appears in the painting on the left. And over there is a portrait of Eugène Manet, Edouard's brother, that shows how subtly Degas could suggest that someone was not quite at home in this world. He was the brother of Edouard Manet and the husband of Berthe Morisot, but he never really achieved very much on his own. As you all know, he loved showing people hard at work, doing something. It might be members of the orchestra of the Opéra de Paris. Every one of them a portrait, by the way. The bassoonist in front was his friend Désiré Dio. Or it might be the corps de ballet going through their paces while somebody's mother whiles away the time reading a newspaper. Or it might be the racetrack, where actually he enjoyed the preliminaries as much as the race itself. One horse race is pretty much like another unless you have money on the horse. But there was no end to the ways that he could record the comings and goings beforehand in his off-balance manner. He had a direct, uncluttered way with the myriad new possibilities that modern life was offering an ambitious artist. He could do low life, he could do high life, he could do the life that lay somewhere in between. Who else ever called a picture laundresses with a toothache? Or gave the same quality of attention to men at the stock market or to a woman having a pedicure? But then all of life was theater to Degas, and he gave it the sharp, fine attention that he gave to the theater itself, whether it was Harlequin up to his tricks or a group of dancers in Russian costume. But unlike the pure Impressionists, he never let his visual impressions push him around. Yet he sided with the Impressionists both on moral grounds and from personal friendships. But 5 years after the first Impressionist exhibition, he told them he really couldn't go on with that name anymore. What about realists, he asked, because that's what he thought he was. They wouldn't hear of it. He was absolutely right, of course. Paintings like these have a grave, considered, meticulously realistic quality that was the antithesis of the flicker and flutter of Impressionism. That's a scene in the family cotton business in New Orleans. Again, every figure is a portrait, members of the family and partners. And here is a portrait of his school friend, Henri Rouard, who grew up to be a famous collector and industrialist, and he's painted in front of his factory. But if we are to make up a list of people who stood by the Impressionists in times of stress and strain, Degas would have to be included. Because so many of Auguste Renoir's paintings are so full of a sweet good humor, and because he himself, as a young man, was charm personified, we're apt to think that paintings like these were made as naturally as a bird sings and with as little effort. This had to be an untroubled art, we think. And pictures like these, the box at the theater and the swing, might make us believe this even more. And perhaps so would Renoir's self-portrait when he was 35. He was what used to be called a pretty fellow, neat in his dress, neat in his beard and moustache, neat in his jaunty little hat, hard to resist when he turned his large, liquid gaze upon you. Nor did he flatter himself in that self-portrait. When he was painted at 26 by his great friend Frédéric Bazille was about the same age, he looks like the kind of alert, receptive, unstuffy sort of person we'd most like to know. He was a favorite house guest in his youth. He kept his friends almost without exception until extreme old age. And if he was found jumpy, changeable, edgy, nervous, well, his friends learnt to live with it. When he was still very young, he could paint flowers like this that convince us that they could never droop or die. In these pictures, he's like a nightingale that never had a sore throat. But the truth is that art never came easily to Auguste Renoir. The path to the paintings that we all love was long and slow. Not at all because he was lazy. On the contrary, when he was in his teens, he would give up lunch to go to the Louvre every day. In the Louvre, he fell in love with French 18th century painting, particularly Boucher and Fragonard. In fact, he said it was his first look at Boucher's Diana bathing that made him determined to be a painter. He started copying the Louvre when he was 19, and later in his life he said, the only place for a man to learn to paint is the Louvre. His brother described him when he was very young, setting off for drawing classes in Paris, carrying a portfolio bigger than himself. And later it was said of him that when he was not working, he was like a body without a soul. Nevertheless, it took him quite a while to hit his stride. That very early painting, The Return from the Boating Party, has a little something of Watteau's famous treatment of the same subject, the embarkation for Cythera. But it has a meaty, solid paint structure that comes right from the center of French 19th century painting. It's a good picture, but it's not one that says Renoir to us in a voice that we recognize. In fact, there were to be a good many paintings before Renoir was Renoir. It was as though an unfinished self had taken over, in such paintings as the portrait of his father, or the group portrait of friends from his first youth at the little inn at Marlotte near Paris, where they had many a happy evening. The man in the big hat is the painter Alfred Sisley. Renoir became Renoir when he painted his friends. Very soon, he became a close friend of Monet, of Pissarro, of Bazille, and even of that most difficult of men, Cézanne. When he had no money and no place to go, Bazille took him in. At other times, in other ways, Monet helped him out. He may have been short of collectors, but he was never short of a friend. Anyone who wonders if the pre-Impressionists were a band of brothers in the 1860s only has to look how Bazille is set before us. Intent, at ease, doing what he cared about most in the world. And this painting, this portrait, was later owned by Manet. And look how Monet is set before us, almost within touching distance, and yet completely undisturbed by having Renoir so close at hand. Renoir, like all his colleagues, always had his eye on the salon. He was the son of a small-town tailor, and to put it plainly, he didn't have a bean. If he didn't sell, he didn't eat. And the best place to sell, as I've said already, was the salon. Well, he knew that Monet had gotten into the salon in 1866 with his Camille over there, portrait of the young woman he was to marry. Why shouldn't he, Renoir, do the same and try his luck with a big figure piece? I cannot imagine that his big painting here of the engaged couple, usually taken to be Sisley and his future bride, was not deliberately intended as a pendant for Monet's Camille. Even the striped skirt is an echo. However, it was refused by the salon. But it did become one of the most famous images of its day. And Picasso was only one of the later painters who looked at it hard and thought about it. In fact, in 1919, Picasso made a drawing after this painting when he heard that Renoir had died. It also tells us something about Renoir as a human being in the rapt and courteous attitude of the young man and the adoring, if somewhat comatose, response of the young woman. Renoir adored the idea of dalliance with a beautiful young woman, but he never lost his practical, down-to-earth side. What a painter needs in a wife, he said, is reliability, patience, not romance. He also said, for me, the Louvre is Delacroix. And he had very much in his mind's eye Delacroix's famous women of Algiers in their harem. Like Delacroix, like Matisse, he loved to fantasize about beautiful North African women lolling around in their silks and satins and doing nothing whatsoever. And in 1870, he painted that fantasy twice over. However, unlike Delacroix, unlike Matisse, he had never been to North Africa, but he didn't let that deter him, and he gave his reclining Algerian woman the look of a beautiful slave by boxing her into a space so small she can't even lie down. And here is Matisse continuing the odalisque tradition of French painting with his odalisque of 1923. And here is Renoir's second take on the Algerian theme. And if this woman looks somewhat ill at ease, it may be because she was not a professional model at all, but the wife of a Parisian carpet dealer. Monet loved this painting and kept it by him all his life. And just for fun, a jump forward, there is Picasso painting his future wife, Jacqueline, in the same mood. So Renoir, in his pre-Impressionist days, was a bit all over the place. He could come on strong and heavy, as happened with this painting of a woman with a seagull's wing on her hat. This has the rich, slow pulse beat of which Courbet was such a master. Now, I doubt that anyone seeing this painting in 1868 could have foreseen that within 10 years, Renoir would perfect the light-filled, flickering idiom for which he got to be famous. Nor do I think that people in the Salon of 1870, seeing his bather with a griffin, would have imagined the Renoir painter of everyday life. If anything, they might probably have thought it looked backwards to the 18th century with its heap of discarded clothes and the frisky little dog there, or perhaps even further back to antique sculpture because of the grave and monumental handling of the woman's body. As late as 1872, Renoir was still all over the place in his art. Now, perhaps thinking he would conquer the salon once and for all, he came back another time to Delacroix and an imagined Algeria in his Parisian Woman in Algerian Clothes. Now, to challenge comparison with one of Delacroix's most famous and successful paintings was obviously foolhardy. To say that it didn't come off is an understatement. Obviously, the jury of the Salon felt that, and they discarded it. So, in those days, Renoir was a bit of a muddle, but a muddle with a future. In the standard histories of Impressionism, it's always Monet who makes the running. However, there was someone else who was in back of the movement all through the 1870s, and that was Camille Pissarro. Not as a leader of the Impressionists, but as a counselor, as a confidant, as a conscience. He was older than the rest, that's clear to see. That's a self-portrait of 1873. He wasn't much over 40, but he already looked like an archetypal elder. And when he painted himself in 1903, he looks 202. His was a caring, steadfast, generous nature, but he took things very hard. If we look at his big landscapes of the 1860s, ample, perfectly realized, we can see just what the novelist Émile Zola meant when he said, "A painting by Pissarro is the work of an honest man." And it's a tribute to Pissarro that at one time or another, Monet, Renoir, Degas, Cézanne, all recognized that quality in him. At a crucial moment, as the Impressionist movement was starting in 1869, he was invaluable. And in 1870, it would happen that he and Claude Monet would paint side by side in the little town of Lucienne where they lived. The snowscape is by Monet and Lucienne in the Rain by Pissarro. But the encounter with another artist that was to be the most fateful was with Paul Cézanne. Now, in their backgrounds, they had absolutely nothing in common. However, at one time, for a while, their working relationship was one of the most important in the history of European painting. If you look at the portrait of Cézanne by Pissarro, 1874, and then Cézanne's self-portrait of the following year, you can see they had a shared quality. These were two people who simply had to talk to one another. And it wasn't a question of shouting their heads off in a Parisian cafe either. It was the real thing, the slow thing, the thing that had to be worked through day after day and week after week. They got the chance to do that in the early 1870s, when Cézanne was longing to get out of Paris. His mistress had had a son by him, and they had to escape somewhere from his father. Pissarro made it possible for the three of them to move to the country not far from him. And Cézanne walked the 2 miles to Pissarro, there and back, every single day. And here is Cézanne sketched by Pissarro. They didn't look a bit like Renoir and Bazille and their friends in Paris. They didn't wear ties and collars and jackets with velvet trimmings. They looked like explorers on their way to a new continent, booted for all eternity and with a stout stave to ward off possible attacks by tigers. It's Cézanne on the left with a dark beard and Pissarro on the right. And when you see how tenderly Cézanne sketched Pissarro on the same occasion, you can well understand that Cézanne said that when he was in trouble, he turned to Pissarro as to God the Father. For this time, when they were working together, Cézanne submitted himself to Pissarro's guidance. And they too, quite often, worked side by side, the same place, painting the same subject. Here they are working in Pontoise. The Pissarro is the snow scene. However, it could not have been easy because Cézanne was every bit as stubborn as he looked. His friend from his school days, Émile Zola, wrote about him. To convince Cézanne of anything is like trying to persuade the towers of Notre Dame to dance a quadrille. Age has developed his obstinacy, but it has not given him anything rational to be obstinate about. He's all of a piece, rigid and hard under the hand. He won't even discuss what he's thinking about, partly because it tires him to talk, and partly because if he lost the argument, he might have to change his mind. When they were close together, Pissarro was a man for whom the study of landscape was all-encompassing. It was everything he needed. Cézanne, on the other hand, had led in art a double, a treble, if not a quadruple life. He could paint portraits. There he painted his father. It has in it all the horror of family life in a beautiful but tight-shut town. Cézanne's father was Mr. Moneybags, and he looks it. When he painted his sister playing Wagner to his mother as sole audience, it looks a little better, but not much. By the 1860s, he was already a master of still life. He could take everyday objects and make them into a metaphor for stability and permanence. And he could paint landscapes. He could build a solid wall of paint on the canvas in such a way that he and the rocks of the forest of Fontainebleau merged and became one. But there was another, stranger, wilder Cézanne who fantasized about people murdering other people in dark places, about people getting cut up. And those fantasies, those dreams, didn't go away. He dreamed about St. Anthony, driven almost out of his mind by beautiful women. He dreamed of imaginary afternoons in Naples, where temptation did not have to be resisted, and where the words room service took on a new meaning. Even when he painted in the open air, as Pissarro urged him to do, maybe this is a portrait of himself on the job, he was harried, obsessed, delighted by visions of quite another kind. This one is called the eternal feminine. But when he was near Pissarro, his landscapes took on a remarkable stability. Now, to show you what I mean, when he was working on his own in 1870 in the south of France, painting melting snow, it looks as if not just the snow, but the whole hillside is going to collapse, engulfing the red-roofed houses down there. 5 years later, working with Pissarro near at hand, the right angles, the verticals, the horizontals are all in equilibrium, and the little cluster of newly built villas looks impregnable. Pissarro was not the kind of man who ever painted anything furtive or ambiguous. If he gives us a harvest scene, we can be pretty sure that that is a harvest where nothing went wrong and where nobody's in a hurry. Cézanne, however, rather liked secrets in landscape as in anything else. And when he painted the place called the Hanged Man's House, he gave it a twisting, turning, shut-in quality that would have been very alien to Pissarro. However, to the end of his days, Cézanne liked to say that he was a pupil of the humble and colossal Pissarro, as he called him. And it was in Pissarro's company that he emerged as one of the great artists of all time. Well, with Manet, Monet, Degas, Renoir, Pissarro, Cézanne, we have met quite a number of people from our cast of characters. But there were others who counted in the history of Impressionism. Let's have a quick look at a few. There was Sisley, for instance, an uncomplicated, angelic painter who could show us a catastrophic flood in such a way that we completely forget the filth and the destruction that a flood brings with it. There was Berthe Morisot, as beautiful a woman as ever held a paintbrush, and one of the most gifted. her future brother-in-law, Edouard Manet, could not get enough of her as a model. There are 2 portraits of her by Manet. And here are 2 outdoor scenes by Berthe Morisot, light-fingered, peopled as usual with her by members of her own family, her husband, her little girl, her sister, and her niece. There was Mary Cassatt, an American living in Paris, who was accepted as a peer, as a colleague by the Impressionists. There was Eva Gonzalez, a young French woman, very much admired by Manet, who painted this portrait of her when she was 20. She had gifts. Manet taught her for a while, but she died in childbirth in her early 30s. There was Gustave Caillebotte. Until recently, he was known mainly as the man who formed the magnificent collection of Impressionist paintings that is now in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Behind him, you can see a little piece of Renoir's Moulin de la Galette, one of his more enviable acquisitions. But more recently, he's come to be recognized as a considerable painter on his own. And we mustn't forget some of the people who wrote about Impressionism. If you were painted by Manet, as it happened to the Anglo-Irish critic George Moore, or the French critic Théodore Duret, it was a fast track to immortality, even if, like Duret, you were upstaged by a lemon. And so the Impressionist adventure was underway. Great pictures had already been painted. There were many, many more to come. And nothing would ever look quite the same again. If our cast of characters had one thing in common, it is that they all went on learning. They pushed themselves as hard as they could, and then they pushed a little bit harder. Theirs was never a stale or a stagnant art. And for ourselves, as much as for the men and women who painted them, those pictures are a learning process, a school for seeing. In that school, happiness is headmaster. Thank you.
This presentation was made possible by a grant from the Dillon Fund.